100%.
It's the coolest show, you know, keep the culture connected. It's the coolest show, you know, in your ear, yeah, respected. Expert level information, entertainment, education. Rev Yearwood got you covered as you hit your destination. Climate rules everything around me. Cream. For those who lost focus, close your eyes and just dream. Open your third eye, now the world is your off. Coolest show, you know, it's the hip hop call.
This is Rev Yearwood, your host of The Coolest Show, and I'm excited for this conversation for so many reasons. Many of you know I really believe that our solution to the climate crisis is using culture and using those who are using art and those who understand the importance of using one's creative expression to shape one's political experience. And so in that, I came across, and actually I'm a part of now, but came across an amazing film. And I have both the directors here and the executive director here with me. And I'm so glad to have them so we can have this conversation. One, the great thing about this is that they are from Detroit. So I love that because it's like, you know, and for folks who don't know, these are from my lighter hue listeners. We say sometimes Detroit versus everyone. And if you understand folks from Detroit, they really mean that. I mean, that ain't no slogan. That ain't no saying for them. They really mean Detroit versus everyone. So if anyone, I think, is going to help us to solve this climate crisis, I wouldn't be surprised actually if it's some folks from Detroit figured this thing out. So with that, I actually have with me the amazing, she will introduce herself, but she's the amazing, just prolific, phenomenal Dream Hampton. Dream, how are you?
I'm well. Thank you for having us, Rev.
Yeah.
Yes, I do represent Detroit all day.
There
My
it is.
favorite, one of my favorite moments from this Richard Pryor skit. He's like, he talked about being on some all night bender, and you wake up and he's like, where am I and how do I get to Detroit? That's like it's an orientation for Black folks. But yes, and I also have one of the filmmakers who's a part of this video series, which is called Swollen. And this is Desmond Love from Detroit. Desmond,
What's up, people?
Yeah.
Desmond, can I just say that I just love your name, Love. Can I just say that off the top?
Thank you. A lot of people don't believe it's real.
Right. He had it. It was before Diddy.
It was before Puff.
Yeah.
Before No, actually, I had a good friend, and I knew some Loves actually. So I wonder, did you know some history behind that? Like, is that like a name that Black folk just was like, yo, we want a new name. We don't want this Thomas, so we want Love. I mean, I guess that's something you kind of researched already, or?
No, I need to look into it actually. Yeah, I don't know much about it.
Well, you can't name like Love or that. That's come on. I mean, if I was Rev Love, if I was Rev Love, I mean, can you imagine if I was Rev Love, would this be like? That would be.
Your
amazing.
First name is Rever?
Yeah, no, my first name actually it's funny. I have two last names, and my first name is the last name is Lennox. If you've been Lennox Mall, like in Atlanta, like that's Lennox.
Around the station.
Yeah, or air conditioning, or China with one less N actually, but it's Lennox and it's Yearwood. But Rev is just I'm a junior, so I didn't want to be called like Deuce or Junior. or something like that. So Rev is it. But I'm just actually excited to have you both with me in this conversation. Dream, I'm actually going to start with you because I want to actually get into just what is Swollen. You kind of actually start off with that. So for folks who don't know what is Swollen, what is Swollen? What's the concept? Give us a little bit of background on that.
Yes. Well, since Desmond is here, I can tell you that this actually began as a smaller, more personal film called Freshwater that I was making about my old neighborhood that often finds itself underwater. That was a poem of the film. It was meant to be like portraiture and a little bit impressionistic, and Desmond did some shooting on that. And while we were in my old neighborhood, which at the time was Desmond's current neighborhood, I got to see all of I know that resilience is a complicated word, but I got to see all the practices, the kind of resilience practices that people were attempting as they were fighting back the flooding that was happening increasingly almost every season. And that included all kinds of jerry-rig situations that Desmond can get into, what was used to be in his old neighborhood. But they were basically bailing themselves out of this kind of seasonal thing that was recurring, that was creating a lot of damage. I had just come off of making 3 pretty didactic projects. And by didactic, I mean didactic. I don't mean to insult anyone who's listening to this. Of course, y'all know what that means, but literal. You know, I had made Surviving R. Kelly, which was quite literal. I had made a show on BET, a 6-part series called Finding Justice. That was also quite literal. And I had done a project that we shot inside of a men's prison in Indiana called It's a Hard Truth, Ain't It? It was on HBO, and it was also quite literal. And so Freshwater was a way for me to heal from that. But even as I was trying to do this like healing poem of a film, I saw that there was a need to do another kind of literal docuseries on basically the Great Lakes. So when we talk about flooding, we often are talking about coastal areas and the Great Lakes and cities around the Great Lakes, which are often Black cities. And we focus on 3 of those cities: Cleveland, Milwaukee, and Detroit. Detroit is being is experiencing flooding for a number of reasons, but we sit on Lake Huron. Milwaukee sits on Lake Michigan, and Cleveland sits on Lake Erie. So you have at once the biggest depository of fresh water in the world. And we are dealing with rising water levels that are compromising infrastructure, and the folks in those communities are left to try to, fight back. So we want to deliver a fuller picture of the relationship between race and climate change, and raise critical questions related to what is to be expected with the coming floods. Last thing I'll say is that what we did was, and as an executive producer, I, raised some money and basically re-granted folks, so paid filmmakers who were local to the areas to create their own projects with very little kind of like feedback from myself. And we found those filmmakers outside of Desmond, who I knew. We found those filmmakers through dealing with racial justice, climate orgs in the local areas. So in Milwaukee, that meant dealing with people like Brenda Coley, who's the executive director of the Milwaukee Water Commons. In Cleveland, that meant dealing with another organization, Cleveland Neighborhood Progress, and they connected us. I was like, who does video for y'all? Like, who be shooting for y'all when you want to tell some of your stories? I want to give them some money to produce a film to be part of this series. So that's how it happened.
That's beautiful. Well, actually, speaking of Brenda Coley.
Oh, there she is.
She joined us. So hi, Brenda. Welcome to The Coolest Show.
Hello, Rev.
It's really so nice to have him. I'm having this amazing conversation here with Dream Hampton and Desmond Love. So really glad you can be with us. I'm actually want to start with you, Brenda. For folks who don't know you, who is Brenda Coley and who is your community?
Oh, that's a big question. I would say probably from the time I was 10 or 11 years old, I seemed to have this propensity for people who were different from me. So I lived in an all-Black city in Gary, Indiana. That's where I was raised, here on the Great Lake, Michigan, which I am Lake Michigan. And so seeing people different so I've spent my life, I always say, explaining gay people to straight people, explaining Black people to white people, explaining explaining men to women, talking about transgender issues, the climate, the environment. I'm always in those areas, thinking intersectional and with a social justice lens.
That's amazing. Thank you. Desmond, same question for you, actually. I want to just give you the same thing. Who is Desmond Love and who is your community?
Man, that's a deep question, man. Oh, she answered it pretty well, so let me give her a shot. Who am I? Dang.
Yeah, no, real. That's like, I really want to know, like, who is Desmond Love?
I don't know. It's, man, nothing serious. I'm a filmmaker. Used to be a photographer, so I'm a director and director of photography. So I really just do creative things inside of media as much as I can. That's really the only thing I do. I don't go out and do nothing. I just create. Like if I'm outside, I have a camera in my hand. And beyond that, I'm at home. That's it. I'm pretty boring. Like I don't do much besides travel.
No.
I travel a lot. I've been to like 12 countries so far. So if I leave the house, I'm going to a different country.
So you go like straight from Detroit to Ghana. That's the thing. You don't even stop. You don't even stop. You don't stop at the coffee shop. Like,
that's funny. You said Ghana because Ghana is one of his spots. Yeah, Ghana is actually one of his spots. That's so funny. You just pulled that one out. See?
I'll be there.
Just straight, yeah. All right. That's what's up. Well, Dream, I want to ask you the same question because I think I know you. I've been around you for a while, but
I have a really short bio. I'm a filmmaker and writer.
No, but I don't want the bio. I don't want the bio answer. I want the who is Dream.
It's not
Hampton.
for no podcast. It's not for no podcast. I'm a private. Dream Hampton's deeply private and committed, to finding some justice in this world. And I've been that way, I first got activated as an organizer when I saw Don Cornelius talking to Stevie Wonder on Soul Train one Saturday morning. I was in my pajamas. And I'm sure that Stevie Wonder had been pulled aside by someone like Harry Belafonte, who himself had been pulled aside by Winnie Mandela and other women of the movement in South Africa who had decided to begin a boycott, divestment and sanction campaign against the apartheid government of South Africa. And Stevie Wonder was talking about companies. I remember I was in the 4th grade, I think, 9 years old, and he was talking about companies that wouldn't divest from apartheid South Africa. And Shell was one of them. And there was a Shell near my house on Chalmers and Harper. And I remember I had a science project and I turned it over, the board, the white poster board, and I put, boycott Shell, free South Africa on it and went outside in the middle of the winter with my little sign. I didn't know that the poor little Arab guy who owned that Shell had nothing, that it was like franchises, you know what I mean? But people were like stopping and talking to me and I was like, Stevie Wonder said, So in that story, I guess there is actually this idea that artists can be one part if they're not the entire story. And sometimes that, gets when our organized and we mess that up. They're absolutely not the entire story, but they can be a tool in terms of getting out a larger message. And Winnie and the women who were supporting the ANC at that time understood that, and they pulled aside someone like Harry Belafonte, and then he went and he got Stevie to say something important when Don Cornelius came at him with that little long skinny microphone and asked him whatever he wanted to ask him that day. And that started me on my journey around social justice. And it was an international, movement. And I remain the same to this day.
Well, imagery is powerful, Dream. Thank you for that. And I mean, that's something that I believe is what starts our story I want to thank you all for this story, for putting together Swollen, and I hope that after people listen to it, they are again intrigued to not only see this work but to support this work. I will tell you personally, and as I think some of you may or may not know, I am originally from Louisiana. That is my community, and one of the things that keeps me going actually is the fact of Hurricane Katrina and doing this work, and dealing with that flood that happened to New Orleans. And so for me, listening to the stories of those who were impacted, particularly my community, Black, brown, young people, just folks from the Gulf drowning, really impact me. So to hear about this, honestly, when Dream first actually came to me, I didn't even know actually that there was this much flooding. Actually, I didn't. This actually kind of, when I first listened, I was like, I think is it snow? I mean, I was like, what are you talking about? I was like, and then she went into it. Yeah, no, she went
No, but
into
Rev, we should let Brenda talk about that, because I remember
Yeah.
getting on the phone with her, because she was, recommended to me, and I was asking, I said something about, I don't know what I said, but Brenda had such a good answer about, basically what's been happening to our cities and the degreening of these spaces, and how vulnerable they are because of so-called development. So, Brenda, do you mind talking a bit about, why there is flooding in Milwaukee?
Yeah.
And what's happening with Lake Michigan?
I think I first want to start with rising lake levels, or lake levels descending, is natural. It's really the way that the lake takes care of itself. So that's a natural process that's happening, but it's in overdrive now because of the frequent rain events that we have, and also because the climate is not climate, the globe is getting warmer, and all of this, and a lot of that is human made, mankind made. But so the flooding, the interesting thing about climate resilience and flooding, so we have a stormwater system that can only really take in so much water, because what we don't want to happen is for the floodgates to open and the water goes back to the lake untreated. So we wanted to go through the system that will treat the water, clean the water before we dump it back in. But when we have these huge rain events, we have no choice but to open up the floodgates, open up the tunnel, deep tunnel we call it, and let the water out, because we don't want so much basement backup and flooding. So what does that do? That flooding that's happening in areas that Black and brown people mostly live in, because of this old housing structure. It doesn't have the infrastructure to handle this, is that you have to recover from this over and over and over again. It's not a one-time event. So I can afford that my furniture got wet in one time, but if it happens again in 2 months and again in 3 months, then that becomes a problem. Also, it is toxic, to have that rainwater coming up sometimes through the system. So that's why. But I think, in terms of looking at climate resilience, we really should be looking at the people who are resilient in the first place and who have survived being disadvantaged and being oppressed. What systems, what things have they put in place in order to be resilient? That's who we should be looking at. We should be talking to indigenous folks in this country, across the country. How did they steward the planet before all this happened? And what can they do? Because there were there are things to manage before, always.
Brenda, I have a follow-up question to that, but I just want to make sure, is everybody good to go to 4:15 Eastern Standard Time? I know we started a little late. Does that work for everybody?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So Brenda, I have a follow-up to what you just said. I think you mentioned earlier about the movement to get around environmental justice and being intersectional.
Mm-hmm.
I've been in each one of these cities actually for an uprising. I've been in Cleveland for an uprising. I've been in Detroit for an uprising. I've been in Milwaukee for an uprising. And then you're now talking about swollen and about how there's a connection, how the waters are rising as well, from an environmental justice situation. Do you see a direct correlation? Do you see that climate justice is racial justice, and racial justice is climate justice? Do you see that in as you are looking in your work in Milwaukee and just throughout your lens?
Well, you know, the environmental movement, when I came into it about 5 or 6 years ago, it was really a movement of white middle class people, especially older people who had the time to put into it. But it was not, the environmental movement was not sustainable in that way. If they were going to, the politicians knew there was no there behind it, meaning that the people weren't really informed. So the environmental justice knew that it had to have a social justice leaning. And when we're talking about intersectionality, we're talking about Black feminism. That's what they bring to the table, seeing that all these issues are interconnected. So the environmental movement, Milwaukee Water Commons, is unabashedly speaks on intersectionality and credits Black feminism for that perspective. So it's people and planet. The same systems that oppress people are the same systems that oppress our planet as well. And when we get that together, you know, and become to realize that we are responsible to steward, especially our water, and that means that we have to take responsibility for it as well. So we get to enjoy it. Everybody should have a bit. I'm talking too much. Yes.
No, you're not. Keep going.
No. I was ready to go get my T-shirt, a Milwaukee brush, everyone. I was ready to. No, keep. No, that's.
I had a follow-up question for Brenda, Rev.
Most definitely.
Yeah. So, and thank you for bringing in Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw's ethos and ethic around intersectionality and naming that as a Black feminist principle. I also love citation as a Black feminist principle. One of the things that the filmmakers that we worked with in Milwaukee were able to, talk about was an explanation of the solutions that range from federal infrastructure funding to methods of water capture, like rain barrels, planting trees and native plants, and depaving, which is, I remember that coming up in our first conversation. And when I think about the root, Rev and I are both in LA. We're not in the same space right now. But when I think of like cities like Los Angeles, who basically not just depaved, but deforested the actual city, like went into neighborhoods like Inglewood and in South LA, people call it South Central, but South LA, and literally uprooted trees so that they could have these helicopters. In some instances, they actually painted numbers on residents' roofs. They had no choice. They had budgets for helicopters. In Detroit, we didn't have budget for those kind of the ghetto birds, as Ice Cube used to say, that used to nightly patrol the neighborhoods here in Los Angeles. But that kind of same deforestation of our cities happened, and that history, and I know that doesn't go back as far as like the indigenous folks who originally had this land to begin with and their practices. And thank you for bringing that into the conversation. But even to go back a couple of generations and to look at these policies that cities had in place that have been so consequential. Did Milwaukee have anything like that happen in the 80s when this whole tough on crime movement was happening and folks were putting all their city budgets into the police departments and this consequence of like tearing down trees so you could better police residents? Did that happen in Milwaukee also?
I think a couple of things happened in Milwaukee. First of all, in the 60s and 70s, during white flight, from the city, Milwaukee residents helped to build the infrastructure that made it possible for white flight to happen. And then on top of that, they redlined. So white people could move out there, but people of color could not. So we're dealing with old, aging infrastructure, 70,000 lead laterals that are poisoning our children and our pregnant mothers, right? They're at risk for that. And the suburbs are turning their back. They don't want to help when we were the ones that made it possible for them to exist. Second of all is the freeway structure that they put in the city of Milwaukee tore up the Black community. We had a thriving, as was known across the country, we had a thriving small business community. And when that expressway came in, it broke that up. They tried to put it in another neighborhood, as often happens. They tried to put it in a neighborhood that was predominantly Italian, but the folks in that community stood up, and Black people didn't have the power that other community had. So that expressway went through. So what does that do? That tears up community, and it tears up the planet. They don't have the water has nowhere to go. And so, for example, one of our projects is we just got a grant to really plant 350 trees in one community. And we're not talking about what we call in the environmental sector whips. We're talking about huge trees that can really drain that water. But the interesting thing, the way that we do it, is we have community engagement and maintenance. It makes no sense to tell people that they need to plant a tree when the tree they got in their yard is on their roof or it's sticking out of their garage, right? And so traditional environmentalists never thought about maintenance. They only thought about planting these whips by volunteers from Northwestern Mutual or something like that, and what lived would live. And that's not a bad strategy when we're talking about riparian areas near rivers and lakes, but it's not how you plant trees in an urban setting. So, and we know that in Milwaukee, that you can look at a zip code and see and figure out how many trees are going to be in that zip code. So for heat canopies, trees help, stormwater retention, trees help, beauty, mental illness, mental health. All of this is in a tree.
I love that.
No, I love that too.
The piece about mental health.
Yeah,
because Rev, you just came back from Rev was just in COP in Egypt, and there were so many youth there who were advocating to have that mental health piece be a part of any conversation that we have around climate and justice.
Yeah,
they're all connected.
It's definitely all connected, and definitely I love that piece as well. Actually, Desmond, I think that kind of, when I was thinking about mental health, one thing was the beauty for all of you. Let me say this film is beautiful. Like it's just really, it's soothing. Maybe I just needed a little bit of therapy watching the film, but it was just really beautiful and just, man. And so for you, Desmond, 2 questions. Just talk about the flooding in Detroit. What does it look like when it floods Detroit? And then kind of maybe give folks a little bit of the nuts and bolts of like when you're filming this project, like what does your crew look like? How did you approach this? Those kind of things because I'm telling you, for folks who are going to watch it, this is beautiful. And this is actually very sad. On one hand, in other words, it's very poetic, but let me let you explain that. So what does flooding look like in the D? And
all right,
talk about your filming process.
So I'm gonna start this off by saying, I just left Vietnam like a month ago, and I just so happened to be there for a typhoon, and it was a level 5 typhoon, so it was like 180 kilometers an hour wind. I was right on the water. It was crazy. It was the roughest sleep I ever had, like through the night. But when I woke up in the morning, everybody was outside picking up tree branches, cleaning up the street. Everything was just kind of getting back to normal after the typhoon hit. A typhoon is a hurricane within a tropical part of the world. So the same thing as a hurricane, but just different location in the world. But this city I was in, Da Nang, had no flooding. The power was still on. And people
Mm.
just went back to their normal day. It was like nothing happened. And it was the wildest experience. The winds were crazy, the water was crazy. If that would have happened in Detroit, we would still be recovering to this day. And that was like a month and a half ago. Like when it floods here in Detroit, it looks like those photos you see in National Geographic of like the Dominican Republic and the Bahamas, like people wading through the water and like cars, people sitting on top of their cars on the freeway, and like it's like Detroit, like people in the lines, like waiting on help on top of their sedan, and like walking, trying to climb up the side of the freeway. Just it's craziness. I remember the first time I saw it, I was like, "That's here." Like it's wild. Like you try to get home and you have to like take the long way around because you can't even drive down the main street, and it's just like
Des,
nuts.
Desmond, do you mind if I ask you? I mean, during our filming, Desmond's home flooded, and so when you talk about what does it look like in terms of, and this is kind of what Brenda was saying. This used to be a thing that may happen once every 3 years in the
Yeah.
spring. Now we're seeing it happen every season, right? So every 2-3 months, and people don't. Again, we've already complicated this notion of resilience. Like, why do we have to be resilient in the face of cities that have divested from communities to a point where they're not there, where the resources aren't available to either, build the infrastructure to prevent these flooding, or to have the resources? Because, the person that Desmond was talking to, and I want you to talk about her, Desmond. Desmond was living in the Fox Creek neighborhood, which is a former canal back when Detroit was an indigenous, before French settler colonials came in and colonized it. And in that canal, that area is particularly vulnerable to flooding. So Desmond, can you talk about the woman that you had, the advocate, who basically who's going down to City Hall, every week, advocating for her neighbors, and who talked about sometimes getting more of an answer out of somewhere like FEMA, or being told to reach out to FEMA instead of her own local city government.
Yeah, I was about to get to
What was
that.
your neighbor's name?
Actually, her name is
Mm-hmm.
Tracy. Um, the reason why I brought up the Vietnam story is because of infrastructure. They had the infrastructure for such a thing to happen, and just to compare it to Detroit, uh, you look at Vietnam as a third world country, very poor area, and they hear American city where infrastructure should be like the biggest thing, like nothing, like fix it, money, money. But in the neighborhood where I'm at, where I was, Fox Creek, we didn't really get support from our local government. Like Dream said, we had to depend on FEMA to help us. um, so Tracy has been living over there in the neighborhood. The person in the film, the main person in the film I shot, way longer than me, but she actually owns two homes in the neighborhood, so she has a different investment in what happens when it floods. Like her ownership, her livelihood is being threatened. I was renting in the area, so having ownership of a place where it could just be taken away from you at any moment just from it raining is a whole different feeling of fear that I didn't experience that she had. Not only just like the
Mm.
home, but memories that she keeps in the home. So she has been like fighting hard through different community organizations and getting support from a few local politicians to come in, um, and like just help bring FEMA in. And I can tell you from personal experience, my experience with FEMA, they did end up helping me, but it was a struggle. They did not. It was like you had to like prove that you were in the flood. I don't know like my My basement had almost 8 feet, 5 to 8 feet of water. Like, I won't say 8 feet. It's more like 5 feet of water. I'm exaggerating, but definitely 5 feet. 5 feet of water in my basement. Like, you see it, they send someone out, and I was like, we don't know. Like, huh? So, like, it was a very struggle. It was like a week long struggle of like me going up to they set up a camp at a local high school, and you had to go up there and like beg them almost to like, hey, I got everything you asked for. Like, nope, we need more. Come back next tomorrow. So
Mm.
it's support out there, but they do not make it easy to get it at all.
No, one of the things that just as you're talking, I mean, that's eerily similar to what we hear in so many places, what we heard in the Gulf Coast, what we went through in the Gulf Coast, what we see in many other places. And it is the dehumanizing aspect. You're talking about, it's one of the reasons why many people said, listen, it's not, I'm glad we got a FEMA, but we also need a PEMA, a People's Emergent Management Agency that we can have on ready to go. Dream, as you're listening to both Brenda and Desmond, I am struck that, this story is a story that couldn't have been just isolated to this region. It could be throughout this country and the world. What are your thoughts on the storytelling aspect of this process, and maybe could this conversation, could this story be developed even further to tell more of these stories that are happening not only in that part of the world? And thank you for all those who are part of the film, and thank you for all those who put their stories into it, but throughout this country.
Yeah, for sure. I would love for Brenda to have the last word on this, but I think, bringing back that history that she was talking about, we often look at, Robert Moses as kind of a supervillain in terms of the way that he destroyed, New York neighborhoods by design with these freeways and the displacement and the things that Brenda was talking about. That stuff started in the Midwest. The first freeways were in Detroit, the Lodge Freeway, the 10. Obviously, it was connected to the auto industry. In fact, the auto industry lobbied hard, first in Detroit and then in other Midwestern cities, to not develop public transportation. Because, of course, they wanted to sell cars, freeways, just as Brenda was talking about in Milwaukee. It went through and destroyed Black Bottom in Detroit, which way before Motown was legendary for Son House, died in Detroit for the blues, right? And then jazz, and then, of course, Motown. And so this displacement is historic. It was, it's a part of the history of Detroit. And the Midwest in general. We have a neighborhood outside of Detroit, a suburb, that went all the way to the Supreme Court to defend the covenants that they have on their home titles that keep these neighborhoods what they are, which is white and separate, and to have that kind of donut effect that that Brenda was talking about. So after the insurrections in the late 60s and early 70s, when white flight happened, they tried to create a donut effect where the surrounding suburbs would have like money and resources, and they would starve and divest from those cities in the center, which like Detroit, like Cleveland, like Gary, Indiana, like Milwaukee. But even as a future, those of us who are futurists and who are, or, even survivalists, you go on some of these, and these sites tend to be heavily white supremacist and weird. And, but you go on these sites that are about survival, right? They're all looking at Michigan. They're looking at the Great Lakes as an area, talking about buying all this area up in the Upper Peninsula, acres of land, because they're in their survivalist bunker mentality. They look at the Great Lakes as a place where there's a future, right? That if things go south, if things get as bad as they possibly could, if the climate apocalypse happens, that this would be a place that would be a possibility for climate refugees, right? And right now, in this moment, we are dealing with our own consequences, and with Black folks on the front line. So that's why I centered it here. I know that this is happening in other places. In Michigan alone, I remember Whitmer, she was dealing with like having a kidnapping threat against her, and then in the state, which was not populated by Black folks, there was a huge 1 in every 300-year flood that happened. So it's not just that Black people are being affected by this, but, as a Black person, as a Black Midwesterner, I wanted to look at these city centers that historically have been divested from and were, dealing with their own resilience practices and their own organizing amongst their communities to fight back. And that's why we first went to these organizations. Like, again, like Brenda's organization, and I'll let her hopefully have the last word, but Milwaukee Water Commons, again, was, one of the organizations that we talked to. I think I named, in Cleveland, who we were working with. And yeah, we went to those communities and said, who's the filmmaker that we should talk to? And then they connected us to those folks.
Well, I actually want to give Brenda the last word, but I want to make sure that folks know how to just get in contact with the film. So maybe Prima Desmond, how can folks find the film, or how can they get in contact? Make sure to give your how would you want them people to reach you if they want to reach you?
Yeah, I need to put this. It's already online. It's on. This was a grant. We were the Rockefeller Foundation. We got a grant from them, so it's on their site. And I need to actually put this on our site, on just online, period. But it already exists online. It's called Swollen, and it's on the Rockefeller Center. But every organization, the 3 films that exist as a series, all of the 3 filmmakers have not permission, but the right to, screen it themselves, put it on their own sites. The organizations that we're connected to can use it in any way they want. So there's no proprietary around it. But right now it exists on the Rockefeller Foundation page.
Awesome. Desmond, how can folks find you? How can people reach out to you?
My Instagram. It's pretty much the only place I exist online, really. It's extra decent on Instagram. There you go.
I appreciate that. And Brenda, I'm going to give you the last word here. So first, tell folks how they can find you. And I want you then to finish up with dreams kind of analogy. And I just want to also give you this last word, like what makes you hopeful?
Thank you, Rev. I just want you to know I did hear you speak here in Milwaukee, or you were in Madison, and you were speaking at an environmental event. So I was in the crowd. But anyway,
I hope I did okay.
I think you did great, and it was before the pandemic. And what I really appreciated was the melding of hip hop with the environmental. So that was the first time I had seen that, and so I was just like, it's great.
I love that.
Appreciate that. Definitely.
Yeah. You can get in touch with me through 2 ways. My email is bcoley@MilwaukeeWaterCommons.org. And you can also look up our website, Milwaukee Water Commons, and find me through that source as well. So I invite people to take a look at our website, which tries to sort of give our viewpoint on many of these issues. I think you were asking me to talk about what makes me hopeful, and I consider myself a what do I say? Tragically optimistic, and in that way, I know what the realities are, but I'm optimistic for the future and our ability to do something about it. My hope comes a lot through my relationships, my individual and community relationships, how we help one another. I have a rabid Republican that lives next door to me, but he helped me out when there was a flood. He of course, he had the generator, and he hooked that generator up to my house. So even though he came to my door and asked me, do you want me to do this? And I said, of course I do. And so in those relationships, those kinds of things make me hopeful, not necessarily in the structures that we have invented. I think that there is, I'm a little unhappy that the racial reckoning that happened with George Floyd's death has not gone far enough. And so I know we had the beginnings of a movement, but it wasn't a complete movement. It looked like a movement. That's what Angela Davis said. It has the beginnings of a movement, but it was not, so we have more things to do to support that work. So it means really for us to be involved. We can no longer trust the government to look out for our interests. We have to be involved. We have to be our own advocates, and we have to somewhat make it easier for people to participate. And that's what I try to do, make it easier so that we can figure out the innovation that is at the community level, because that's where the innovation is.
Well, Dream, Hampton, Desmond Love, and Brenda Coley, thank you all so much for being on the coolest show. And thank you all for just being y'all. Thank y'all for just doing what y'all do. And keep on pushing. I know this work ain't easy, but just know if nobody told you today they love you, know Rev loves all of y'all. And
All right.
I am Rev Yearwood, your host of the coolest show.
This is the coolest show brought to you by Hip Hop Caucuses. Think 100%.
It's the coolest show you know, keep the culture connected. It's the coolest show you know, in your ear, yeah, respected. Expert level information, entertainment, education. Rev Yearwood got you covered as you hit your destination. Climate rules everything around me. Cream. For those who lost focus, close your eyes and just dream. Open your third eye, now the world is your off. Coolest show you know, it's the Hip Hop Caucus.